Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm just picking up on the Billy Connolly comment. I had to do a presentation to the Silver Fern Farms AGM a few years ago, and I thought it was a pretty gripping presentation. And there was an old man who sat at the front and just stared at me the whole time. For 30 minutes, sat and stared. And I was the last speaker before lunch, and we went for lunch. And he came up to me partway through lunch, and he was quite an old guy. He started the conversation, as old people do, by saying, "I'm 85, you know." And he said, "Very good presentation." And I still thank you, thinking you could at least have shown it. And he said, "But if you don't mind me saying so, you remind me of Billy Connolly." I went, "Oh, really?" And he said, "And I was sitting there listening to see if you would say fuck." So I completely ruined his day, I'm afraid. Anyway, Dan sent me an email a couple of weeks ago saying Mike Peterson's pulled out at short notice. And I've been around everyone else I know, and no one's got time to do this address, so could you please do it? And I thought, well, you've asked so nicely, I'll say yes. He then went on to say, can you do a half-hour entertaining presentation on strategy? And I thought, oh, yes, sure. So after I've done an entertaining presentation on strategy, this afternoon I'm going to climb Mount Everest in wet jandals. It's about the same level of challenge. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about sector strategies. And I have to say, listening to the conversation over the last hour, you guys are much, much more sophisticated in the way that you think about strategy than most of the people I've dealt with in the primary sector. So I'm going to talk about what's worked and what you need to know based on having done a few of them and getting quite a few things wrong. In terms of the ones I've done, the first one I did was the New Zealand Aquaculture Marketing Strategy. And that was based on, I was brought up on a sheep farm in Gisborne, as you can tell by my strong Gisborne accent. And I thought I knew a lot about the primary sector. And when I was initially a partner in Deloitte in 2000, one of the first jobs I did was to do some strategy work with Wrightsons. This is back in the old days before they were PGW. And I learned quite a lot about mainly the red meat sector at that point. So that qualified me to know everything about the primary sector. So I went and pitched for a job with aquaculture. And the chief executive of Aquaculture New Zealand said, "What do you know about the sector? How would you fix it?" And I thought quickly, because I actually don't know anything about aquaculture, and I said, "with 3 bullets." And I got the job, because he said, "You clearly understand the industry." I have to say, when I finished it, and it was a hideous job to do, an industry that was split between hard-working producers of very high-quality seafood that should be sold at an enormous premium, and a bunch of dysfunctional processor marketers who treated the high-value product like crap. It was a dreadful, dreadful industry. And at the end of it, when we finally finished the report, and it was pretty messy, I have to say, it was consistently referred to as that Deloitte Report by the processors because they hated everything about it. One of them described it as effing communism because I suggested collaboration. And I went back, and when I was doing my final checkout meeting with the chief executive, he said, "Do you still need 3 bullets?" And I went, "Yep, but just for one person." So I'd learned quite a lot about it by that stage. So somewhat emboldened by that, and having forgotten how awful it was, and thinking that it couldn't possibly get any worse, I went and pitched for the New Zealand Horticulture Strategy. And I have to say that was a really interesting process. Different kind of people. In aquaculture, you've got quite a collaborative bunch of smaller producers and a bunch of, as I said, utterly dysfunctional big players, and they hate each other. In the horticulture sector, not that same massive imbalance. It's just a lot of small people who all hate each other. So that was a really, really interesting process. The other key thing that came out of that, from my point of view, was that it was a far more collaborative process, because that's one of the things that we learnt going through aquaculture: get more people on board, get the sector actively involved in running the process. And it worked so brilliantly that when we finished the report and sent it to Horticulture New Zealand, they immediately produced it in their own colours. It was their strategy, and there is one tiny reference in the foreword that acknowledges the assistance provided by Alasdair Macleod and Gerard Mayer from Deloitte. And I have to say, I have never been more proud in my life than working my butt off for months to create an entire document that was a very high quality document, and seeing the industry own it so comprehensively. So I'd had a bad experience, quite a good experience, and then I did the red meat sector strategy. And oh wow, the red meat sector is different. And you know, if I needed 3 bullets and one target for aquaculture, and probably half a dozen bullets realistically to improve the horticulture sector, I think I finished the red meat sector strategy thinking a machine gun and buckets of bullets. One bucket just for one person, but there were quite a few. There's a fair bit of spraying required. However, it was an incredibly engaging process. We originally priced it to do, I think, 50 face-to-face interviews. We ended up doing 137. We engaged with over 1,000 farmers all around New Zealand. And my respect and affection for red meat farmers went through the roof. And my views on processors went through the floor. With a couple of honourable exceptions. And because there are a whole bunch a year, I'm not going to say which 2 I really liked. But one is spectacularly good at branding products and doing the right portion sizes. You can work out from there. So that was an interesting process. But despite all that, and despite the level of active engagement from across the red meat sector, it was still produced as a Deloitte report, which disappointed me significantly, because it was never a Deloitte report. That was just the distilled essence of what came from talking to 1,000 predominantly farmers. I then moved on, because after the red meat sector strategy, I retired. I was absolutely gone. There isn't a tougher gig in New Zealand, in my view. So then, while I was retired up in Hawke's Bay and trying to grow avocados, someone rang up and said, would you like to do the New Zealand International Education Strategy? And because I've got a really, really poor memory, and I forget how difficult these things are, I went, yeah, sure. And launched into that one. Now, that was an interesting process, because for the first 3, I had the power of Deloitte behind me. I had 1,000 people around the country I could call on. I had some of the cleverest brains in New Zealand supporting me. And when I rocked into Education New Zealand, I was on my own. And I thought, the great thing about being a partner is you get other people to do the work. And I hadn't forgotten that bit. So I very quickly got them to assemble a team of people from the sector, and they did all the work. And that bit was brilliant. But in fact, I do want to go on record here and say, I've worked with some sensational teams in Deloitte. I have never in my life worked with a better team than was assembled from across the education sector. These people, they had mana within their own subsectors. Their subject matter expertise was just miles deep, and they were fabulous people. and they learnt to be consultants really, really quickly. They were clever people, and they produced a sensational product, which, interestingly, Education New Zealand kind of started off owning the process, and they paid for it. When the final document was presented to a big national conference, the various subsectors across the industry said quite clearly, now go away. It's our strategy. So the university sector took their strategy and said, we'll implement this, thank you very much. A group in Auckland across 4 of the sectors said, it's ours, we'll own this, just give us some money and leave us to it. So massive, massive sense of ownership. The fact that it was funded by Education New Zealand was just deemed as, that was nice, but it's our strategy. And that's one of the themes that I will continue to draw through for the rest of this presentation. I've also done several regional economic development strategies. I did the original Wellington Regional Economic Development Strategy back in 2000, and I've done a couple on the way through, and I'm currently, because I'm very poor at saying no, that's why I'm up here, I'm leading the Hawke's Bay Regional Economic Development Strategy refresh. So that's the kind of background I'm going to draw on, and I've spent most of my time explaining that. So we'll go through this really quickly. The first critical success factor is you've got to believe that the process is at least as important as the final document. I've worked with clients who've brought in examples of glossy documents and they go, this is what I want to produce. I don't care. If you haven't got a process that deeply engages the people across the sector, then you're wasting your time. The final document's a waste of time. And if you end up believing that the process is more important than the final document, that's just fine with me. Because I actually think, based on nearly 20 years of doing pretty big national strategies, that the success of the process is 80% about the process and the engagement you have and 20% about the final product. In terms of getting something that people believe in. Because when people believe in it, the implementation part, which ultimately is the only bit that counts, has actually got some weight behind it. It's also important, and I'm just going to go through this at 1,000,000 miles an hour, in fact you can all read as fast as I can, that the strategy is sector-owned but commercially driven. Far too often I see people who have completely unrealistic views about where companies should be thinking around supporting New Zealand. All I say to them is, you point to me in the Companies Act, the bit that says we have to think about New Zealand. I chair 6 companies, and the Companies Act is really clear. My duties to the company, not to the shareholders, not to the country. So anyone who bags companies for doing what companies are meant to do needs their head read. So you've got to get support from the commercial part of the sector or the strategy will fail. It's got to be focused on the things that drive behaviour rather than the behaviours themselves. A lot of people get focused on the outcomes without saying what's causing that. Dealing to the causes is way more important than kind of bandaging over the festering sore. You need to find out what's causing the festering sore. It's got to be based on fact. It sounds really obvious, but lots and lots of people say, these are the things I know. Well, half the time the things you know are wrong. And one of the things which took me a long, long time to accept is that even when you've started with a fact base that's maybe 5 or 6 years old, the half-life of facts is actually quite short. So stuff that was absolutely, utterly, immutably true 5 years ago is possibly wrong today. So remember that the facts have to be not just facts that you can verify based on something that happened a while ago, but facts that you can verify based on today. Able to map the options for change in a believable way, action-driven, otherwise it's a dream. Able to acknowledge the good stuff that's been done before. I'll mention this later as well, but every strategy I've been involved in has been built on, there's a pile of previous strategies, usually about waist high, that have all either failed or been partially implemented, or they're just gathering dust. There are always good things in these strategies. And sometimes the reason they didn't work was the timing was wrong. Doesn't mean they hadn't got good ideas. So be prepared to acknowledge and look for the good in what's been done in the past, and be really clear about who is accountable for delivering it. And if you have a project sponsor inside a sector that's responsible for getting the strategy done, let's be really clear before you start about who's actually going to be accountable for delivering it. Key failure factors, and that's something most people don't talk about. Key failure factor is start with an unshakable belief that you know the answer. And I had one hideous experience with a client, a big national client, who called me in and said, I want you to do this piece of analysis and research, and this person's the problem, and at the end of it, I want her sacked. And, well, can we start with an open mind about this? And he said, no, that's the answer I need. So I said, well, find someone else. And he said, no, I want you to do it because I need the Deloitte brand. I'm going, well, we're going to start with an open mind. And about 2 months later, I went and called him into a room with the other shareholder and said, you need to understand that there's not just one person that needs sacking, there are actually two. They're both excellent too. Right? You. I have to say they took it remarkably well. It was 11 years ago. They've never talked to me since, but they took it remarkably well. You need to deal with people who tell you what you want to hear. If you want to fail, deal only with people who will tell you what you want to hear. And in every industry, there are lots of them. The people who will run around telling you everything you want to hear. Don't let the facts get in the way of your beliefs. That's a great way to fail. Talk to only a few people, the ones that are easy to get to. One of the interesting things about strategy is how rarely we listen to the unheard voices, and how difficult it is to get hold of the unheard voices, and how unwilling they often are to engage, and how much value they have when you can dig into it. So if you want to fail, ignore them. And as I said earlier, build a strategy that conflicts with commercial reality. That's a surefire. If you really want one to fail, do that. And ignore the past. Oh, shit, I'd forgotten. I'd added this last night. And rely on a really, really pretty document to sell the whole thing. I would say probably 40% of the strategies I see in my career are relying on a pretty document. And I can't think of a single one ever that's worked. Creating momentum and cohesion, you need to have an engaged sponsor, an agreed vision for both the process and the outcomes. So you need to be really clear about what you're trying to achieve with the strategy process, and then you need to have a very clear, compelling view about what success looks like for the sector, for the future. And then you need blah, blah, blah. You can get copies of this afterwards if you want. I can't be bothered reading that, and I've got 5 minutes to go until lunchtime. You need access to the right people. If you're going to get the sector ready for change, you need support from the right people. Sounds really obvious, but lots and lots of people rely on getting support from people that they're easy to get hold of. If you're going to try and change a sector, you really need to have access to and support from the right people. And you need to work out as part of the process who the right people are. You need information at the right time because, as I said earlier, the half-life of truth is actually quite short. And you need willingness and ability to act on the outcomes from the engagement process. So if you're not willing to commit heart and soul to delivering, no matter how difficult it is, whatever the strategy says has to be done, don't start, because it's a really good way to waste money. And if all else fails, shoot someone. Yeah. If I could be given immunity from prosecution for one day, And I reckon even 20 bullets, I could massively improve New Zealand. So, I thought, because that was all pretty heavy and boring stuff, what I would do is go through, for the people with a lower attention span, the same kind of story but with pictures. And in every sector strategy I've done has always started off with the participants in the sector. Sorry, I'll quickly do this first. The key themes in terms of the lessons I've learned, and some of these have come out already: lack of clarity about who the competition really is, massive fragmentation and almost total lack of scale. I heard all these things coming through in the time I've been here already. Unwillingness to collaborate, and this is something which just bedevils the primary sector in New Zealand. I don't get it. I actually don't understand how New Zealand is good at rugby, because the way that the primary sector behaves, New Zealand should be a country that's good at darts. One person competing against everyone else, hurling pointy things at short range, right? There's a fundamental disconnect here. Focus on product push rather than market pull, and on selling rather than marketing. And that absolutely applies across the majority of the red meat sector, and the horticulture sector, and the aquaculture sector. Huge desire to find a silver bullet, because everyone thinks there's a perfect answer. Well, there isn't. A desire to reinvent everything, because what we did before didn't work. Well, often it didn't work because of timing, as I said. You don't have to throw everything out and start again. And we're absolutely convinced that we can do it better this time, because there's always this huge stack of ones that were done before and didn't work. And I think the final theme for me across multiple sectors is that the answers are there, and a good process with widespread and honest engagement will make them more likely to be found and used. So that's actually a really important message. The answers in any sector strategy don't come from the consultants. They don't come from the people you engage to help you in the process. They come from within you. And if there is a process of genuine, honest engagement, and people are willing to listen to the answers that come out, then you get something that is not only implementable, but people will take it out of your hands if you don't implement it quickly enough, and they'll drive the change themselves. And that's when you really, truly succeed with sector strategies. The bit I forgot to add, that other slide. The high-speed version for the low attention span then is every sector strategy starts with people feeling grossly overloaded, struggling for traction, and feeling that the world is ignoring them. At the same time, the bigger players are worried about sudden destabilizing change because it often exposes some of their private workings that they'd much rather not expose. The smaller players are always complaining about being squeezed out of contention by the bigger players. And generally, the primary sector is incredibly focused on what has happened in the past. And we do tend to ignore the opportunities and indeed the threats that are hurtling towards us. The other problem, and it's just as dangerous, is an obsession with delving into the minutiae and completely losing sight of the big picture. Sometimes the signals that you get through the engagement are confusing. Sometimes they're pretty obvious. And sometimes they're frankly terrifying. But it is important to remember that no matter how old the sector is, flexibility is really important. And a commitment to carrying things through without getting your wires crossed. And when you've done all that, certainly as a consultant, I used to kind of lean back and think, well, thank God that's over, and retire to the pub for a small drink. There's clearly a Wellington-based slide, because in Napier we drink small glasses of wine. And the really important thing is, no matter how good your strategy is, if you don't follow it through all the way to the very, very end, you're better off not starting at all. Lunch!